when I put a picture of my face, I didn't actually think it was going to be that big up there, sorry. So I'm the creative director of Maverick Media in London, and I've been doing that for about 20 years or so, actually more than 20 years, and we work with game developers and publishers and audiences to work and to create content for games and help convey the games to audiences and work on behalf of publishers to advertise games as well. So we've seen a lot of change over that period. We've worked on lots of different platforms, channels, types of game and developers, and I've worked personally in studios around the world, and so we've seen quite a lot of different ways of games being made and produced, for good and bad. And so yeah, that's been applied for, as I say, more than 20 years. This is a bit of shameless eye candy just to fill the dead air for a second.
I don't know if you can hear me.
So I chose that partly because it's 35 seconds, and it sort of shows the general advertising content we create. But as part of our work, we've actually also been innovating a lot with game developers, and we're amongst the first companies to actually take games content and start to use it for different purposes. So up here you'll see different projects. For example, we took a games engine and used it to create linear content. You may notice all of these IPs, some of them you might recognize from PlayStation and things like that, but variously we've worked with the game developers and their assets to get them out of the developers and do something interesting and creative with them. So we're pioneers in that way in types of content creation. We also did lots of work in the early days of viral advertising and crowdsourcing of content as well. And it's amazing to see how that's come on in years since. The tools of our trade, such as it is, are these sorts of bits of software and hardware. You'll recognize PlayStation and Microsoft for Xbox, but the more techie amongst you might recognize some of the logos there. They're essentially the tools for building games content. Previous to these tools, it used to be quite expensive and singular to try and create content. For example, that project I mentioned previously, it was about £1 million a license to have a game engine to build, and the game engine is the thing you build a game in. And now, for example, you can get these for free. So there's a real democratization of the content creation process that's gone on, which is really exciting because the tools have actually become tools of very, very many different types of trade and different things. So, for example, these tools are now being used to create animation. They're being made, I don't know if any of you know, but in Rogue One, which is a Star Wars film, the latest one of the shots was made in a games engine, which is just quite a significant thing because previously that would have been dedicated software to do that. Companies are taking advantage of this new content as well, or new ability to make content, I should say. So, for example, creating applications, virtual reality, augmented reality to augment what they do as a company as well. And also there's exciting new ways of the technology being used to create new spaces for audiences and new connections via content. So it's really exciting. And then we've also got recently very many new players and new channels and new audiences coming in. So you may or may not know some of this, but these are the big sort of companies that have come in with hardware and software applications and interest within this space. So Google obviously have made various VR content, and actually they have their own standard Daydream, which is the current one. Facebook spent £2.5 billion buying Oculus, which is a VR company. Samsung, the first to market with a mass-produced VR headset. And Amazon have bought the largest game streaming video service, Twitch, and they've even got their own games engine. Who would know that? I don't know if anyone knows that here, but that's based on an engine I showed earlier. And even Apple, quietly in the background, have been making some really significant steps into this space. So in the recent iOS 11 update, Apple actually didn't speak very much about one of the most significant things, which is a thing called ARKit. And ARKit allows you to essentially superimpose elements onto the real world, and if you have an iOS-enabled phone, it's already applicable to that, and you'll be seeing lots more content coming through in that in the future. So gamification and game technology is about to become mainstream. And by way of the story that introduces the speech, that's kind of the story of where Reality Lab London has come from. Reality Lab London essentially is, our mission is to create, to help non-games companies take advantage of games technology. We develop, but we're also a conduit to developers in the UK, which is an amazing array of developer talent, many global IPs, and just the different styles and content that can be created is remarkable. So we act as a conduit between large brands and organisations and sometimes government bodies to help them take advantage of that. Still relatively early days, but we've been helping companies to apply games technology and gamification in some different ways. This is a bank application where we've gamified the whole bank offering. Members of our team have essentially built different games for that. So instead of having the flyers in a foyer, you'd have a virtual experience of that bank. We've also created VR applications for training. This is one for insurance training, but we've also created them for, we're creating some for medical training. But we also create entertainment-based ideas, such as a VR experience for a hotel chain, for example, or VR storytelling, using it to relay content in different ways. It's still early days, most certainly, in the space, but we've got some thoughts so far about how these two worlds are kind of coming together, and maybe some suggestions of how that might go going forwards. So I thought, when I was asked to do a speech, I thought what would be useful, what's important to understand from an audience such as yourself. And you can go into a lot of technical detail and stuff, but it actually changes all the time. I think what's probably more important are sort of the mindset ideas. You know, what's kind of made games innovative, and what ideas should we sort of look to and try and replicate perhaps within our processes, and maybe within our processes look as to why they're not happening. So the first idea I thought was experimentation. So I'm going to use a game to kind of talk about this, really. This game is called Republic, the Revolution. It came out in 2003. I remember working on it back then. And it's a game about an Eastern European country, and you can either take the role of the person who's overlooking the country, is essentially a despot, or you can take the role of someone who wants to overthrow the despot. Fantastically ahead of its time, actually, for its because most of the time the games at the time were just running around shooting things. But what was particularly significant about this game was the artificial intelligence that the developer was trying to employ in it. And they were trying to employ an artificial intelligence that reacted in a human way. Very ambitious at the time in terms of resources and the studio. I remember the developer at the time, young, very, very bright developer, but it turned out not to be commercially viable for various reasons. The pressure of the time for sort of getting games out, for them to make money, to sit within a particular sort of stylistic box, all came to bear, unfortunately. So that was a shame, and the developer didn't develop a couple of games after that, but never lost this idea of the AI sort of working. And so he went through various kind of phases of research, but he's a young man called Demis Hassabis, and you may have heard of him or not. He's very, very bright. He's still terribly young after all he's done. He's a chess grandmaster and various things, but he did actually make a company called DeepMind. And DeepMind you will have heard of, I'd imagine, in this audience. And DeepMind obviously got bought by Google and became Google DeepMind. I think they paid about 500 million for it. And DeepMind's mission is essentially to do the same thing as he was trying to do in the game. Create an AI that reacted in a human way. And they've had some real success with that AI. They created an AI sort of implementation called AlphaGo, and that played a game called Go, which was tremendously more advanced than chess. And they never thought a computer would ever beat a human, because it's about human interaction as much as anything else. And unsurprisingly, it did beat it. So it was a real significant point and a significant journey for games technology, a technology that's come from the games industry, quite a humble beginning. And DeepMind is actually in use now with the NHS in the UK, so it's helping doctors and going through records and actually trying to do some things which are interesting. They've obviously got some questions on privacy and things like that, but it's a very advanced technology, and it's something that shows that experimentation, sometimes the thing you set out to make doesn't necessarily end up being the thing you make, but it could be something far greater. So the second idea I'd like to talk about is collaboration. Again, I'm going to use an obscure game reference, and bear with me, it does work. Now, this game is called Curiosity, What's Inside the Cube. Again, some of you, if you're into your games, may remember it. it's a bit like a sort of crowdsourced puzzle game, essentially. And it was variously talked of as being a work of genius and variously derided by the audience. But essentially what you do is you work together as an audience. It's tablet-based or phone-based, so it's a broad piece of content. And you're essentially trying to solve, but chip your way into the center of the cube. And it can't be solved by any one person. So it's a crowd coming together to solve a problem that cannot be solved on an individual basis. And the impetus was to get to the inside of the cube where you would get this revelation, which unfortunately was a bit disappointing in the end, which hinted to the why it didn't do so well. But it was tremendously successful at the time. And I think it augurs an idea of collaboration between both the developer and the consumer, which is a powerful idea and something to be taken on and could be taken on by audiences perhaps, or sorry, developers going forwards. We still haven't quite seen it used properly, but I think there's a really interesting idea where both the developer and the creator are actually collaborating together, and they're not quite sure where the content is going to go, but it's a platform for collaboration coming together. I've seen this actually was quite interesting, an iteration of that same idea. It was a UCL piece of software where it's like crowdsourcing of genetic matching. So this can't really be done particularly well by computers. So they came up with the idea of essentially making something similar to the game I showed you, but you're essentially matching these shapes together. And every time you create a match, then that advances the kind of the understanding of the genetic sequence they're trying to get to. This is actually a VR version of it. They actually have an online version, which is what I'm referring to. But similar idea, but the idea of a crowdsourced problem-solving tool, the crowd coming together to solve something in collaboration with the developer, is a really powerful idea. And the third idea I'd like to talk about is iteration. So this is one of my favourite numbers in games. You probably won't understand what the number refers to. You may understand that reference there. Angry Birds, anybody? Kids do. Yeah, so 51 was a number of games they made before they made Angry Birds, the company Rovio. These weren't iterations of Angry Birds, but they, as they've said in interviews, they were always iterating how they would understand their audience, always iterating to create the moment that when the actual platform comes along, when the audience comes along, and when the design is correct, they will be able to fuse these three elements together to make a perfect piece of software. Now that's a poetic way of saying that, and there's obviously complexity to that, but I think the idea of iterating software and content is really important. And for you, considering gamification in any capacity, I think it's really important to consider how that would work for you. It won't necessarily just be a thing you're going to make, it will be a relationship you're going to create, and you might not necessarily get it right the first time. I'd also like to look at this, which is the free-to-play funnel. The free-to-play game sort of emerged kind of post the banking crisis, where people didn't have much money to really spend. And so you had to give away games for free, and you had to create a new way of actually monetizing this. And this is how it works. So you spend all your money on advertising, you acquire lots of audience at the top. And then that audience variously drifts off, as we mentioned earlier about the 8-second sort of attention span. There's other things in the world, and people sort of go and find other things too, but some do stay. And if you can manage that community, you get a retained community at the center. And then the community management is about talking about the software, it's about tweaking the software as well. And there's constant sort of process here about doing that. But actually, if you can manage to retain them, then that's when you can start to monetize them. And when that's 100 million coming in there, and then that's 50 million at this stage, and you're monetizing 10 million, and sometimes they're spending $20 a month. I know games where they spend $200 a month. That's why that free-to-play model works. Now, if you're looking to create a software model, you would probably have to consider this as an organic process almost. And if you took away the dollars and just had an effect for the sort of things you're trying to create, you would probably still need to go through a similar process where you're constantly managing people in through the top and you're managing the output. So it's not just something you're going to create and leave and expect to work. And I suppose, so how is experimentation, collaboration and iteration kind of being taken up by the clients we're bringing games technology to? And probably they're not really taking it up that well at the moment, or certainly not yet. So, but that's not to say they won't, and I think this is early days, really. So here's some things I would suggest that we take away from these three sort of lessons, really. I think experimenting and understanding that things sometimes fail is really important. And if it's a failure, it's not necessarily a waste. You can take something from it, you can learn from it, and I think it's really important to do that. Collaborate. Expect collaboration. Your audience expect it now. The millennial audience expect to be involved in a process, whether it's involved in the process of game design or involved in the process of iterating the game after it's designed, whatever it is, a platform you're creating. Really important to do. Expect it, plan for it. It's no way a binary process. And then iterate. Measure, refine and improve. It's never finished. The idea of it's forever beta. Your audience is constantly changing. They're constantly having things taken them away to do other things. You've constantly got to be reacting to the audience's behaviour to make your software complement their life. So who's getting it right? Probably to answer that, I think it's probably worth getting a definition of gamification, which at the moment I think is pretty good. Gamification is the process of making things we ought to do into things we want to do. So good example is Night Fuel. Gamifies exercise. It's technical, it's a band and it goes in your phone, etc. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a technical thing you're doing, really. And I think the 5 a day thing, I take part in a gamification most lunchtimes, really, which is in the UK. And it's also in 25 countries in different forms. But the idea of encouraging you to drink or eat 5 portions of fruit or vegetables a day. Now, again, it's not really a technological thing, it's just about delivery. And I think when we heard about Ortec earlier, about the software application not really working because the delivery mechanism, i.e. the person telling them about the software didn't really get that right, this is a good example of how simple it can be. It's a delivery mechanism is a bottle. I go to the shop and I get it. I have context, I understand what the 5 a day is before I go there. All the other bottles in there have got the same thing, so it's consistency. So it works in that capacity. It doesn't need to be a technological solution. So it's not about technology, it is about delivery. Making essentially a consistency. I think for a gamification to be successful, it needs to be delivered to the audience, it needs to be appropriate in the medium, and they must have the information and inclination to be able to take part. So you can't just make a piece of software and put it out there and expect people to take up on it, really. And I think this is true whether your audience is public or private, really. I mean, you're obviously, if you've got an intranet-style application that you want to run for your workforce, it's obviously slightly different, but it's still got to complement their life. It's still got to be at the point where they need it, as opposed to something they've got to do, another work-based task. And I think, again, that's important. Khan Academy, I think, is something I'd quote as a good example of gamification. Now, I'll just run this in the background. This is a Pixar's version of it, where they actually, it's been so successful, it's been taken up by lots of different organisations in different ways. And Pixar was just a nice version to have playing in the background, really. But it just makes use of the available channels. It was born of experimentation. Salman Khan wanted to create content, maths training content for his nephew. So he used the channel that was available at the time, which was YouTube, and used MS Paint. And it was perfectly applicable to that. Now the actual platform isn't much different to that, beyond a gamification of it, i.e. you've got badges to win, and you've got things that sort of track your progress, a bit like the Night Fuel. So for me, that's a really good example, and there's no surprise that the US government are looking at that, have been looking at from 2014 up to this year, as potentially something to be applied on a broader scale. So I'm going to talk a bit about things to come, really, and the potential of gamification going forwards. This is more technical, I suppose, but I think it's interesting to know where it is, and this is probably why I said the gamification definition at the moment, because I think it's going to change massively. So, let's go back. So I think gamification in VR and AR and things like that is going to be really important. But what I think VR particularly is going to be able to do is create some more powerful connections for us in terms of how we come together in both work and in our leisure. And I think they could be really valuable. This is a software called Nanome, which has just received a fair bit of investment from a large VR developer. And essentially it's a scientific collaboration tool, but it works on a sort of scientifically accurate basis. So it allows scientists across the world essentially to collaborate in the same space, which is a tremendously powerful idea, I think, in terms of bringing people together, getting the best out of the best knowledge in the world. And I think it's a really interesting way of using VR as a training tool, but also a collaboration tool, an education tool. So that's particularly interesting, I think. The other application I'd like to talk about is something called Notes on Blindness. And again, you may have seen this if you sort of know VR at all or know the applications of VR at all. It's actually quite it's quite a simple thing. It's actually based on a film called Notes on Blindness, and it's quite dark because it's about somebody going blind. And it recreates the idea of what it is to go blind, which is something obviously someone can tell you and you can close your eyes and try and imagine it, but what it does beautifully is it relays the sensations and the ideas of how you relate to the world in sound, and you know, very, very limited vision. It plays beautifully to the VR format, which is unlike any other format, can place you in someone's shoes in a way which is so empathic that it's been used in lots of different ways already in terms of people, in terms of experimentation and things like that, to try and understand other people's perspectives. And I think that potentially is a really exciting area where, as we talked about earlier about the sort of schisms that are coming around in the world, the idea of creating a tool which can bring people together, not just in industry, but also in empathy, I think could be really powerful, helping people to understand the other point of view. I'd also make a note really in terms of VR, in terms of 360 content. We do a lot with 360 content at the moment for various reasons, but I think you are going to see an era where it becomes really important for electronic news gathering and veracity of you know, content and what things happen. All the major platforms are optimized for it now, so Facebook and YouTube, they put a lot of money into this space, and as with all these spaces, it will be used for good and bad, I think. But the way VR 360 content works particularly is that it's very, very hard to edit. So you kind of create content which is quite believable, and so I think it's very powerful potentially, but also could be in the wrong hands used to subvert media in the way that we were talking about earlier as well. So that's most of me. I think two more numbers to leave you with, which I think is interesting. First is 5.1 million. And the second, when it comes, is 71%. So 5.1 million is, you're probably very much aware of this, is certain estimates of automation leading to job losses, basically. And that's the European Commission's Future of Work study. So potentially 5 million job losses. Obviously some are going to be replaced by the new jobs that arrive, but potentially not all of them. And 71% is the proportion of European males who play games, consoles, regularly. So I would imagine that this figure is going to increase in relation to this figure. And this is only the figure I chose, really. There's lots of other very high figures in terms of people's time in games. And so it's really important to be aware of the game space and gamification and the potential advantages of it, but also the potential people taking advantage of people within this space as well. There's a challenge. Anywhere where people are going to be spending a lot of time, I would imagine, is going to be important to you as an audience collectively. And I think that's me. Thank you.